I felt like I was being punished beyond means. I wanted to get out of there. I felt like I wanted to die.
You're alone and just have nothing but your thoughts. Start talking to yourself.
It changes you, it hurts you, it makes you depressed, makes you want to act out, makes you angry. It's no rehabilitation.
يعني عملي وقت الوقائع 15 سنة ونص. قبل البحث المحكمة ما طعنت في البحث. النيابة ما طعنت في البحث والأولياء الدم يعني قبلوا البحث. مع ذا عاد حكم إعدام.
僕は児童養護施設に入ったのが10歳の頃で、高校卒業までいました。
自己決定の機会がないということですね。でとにかくもう出されたものを食べる、言われた時間にはお風呂に入る、言われた時間に寝るということで、子どもが主体的にですね自分らしく生きるという機会を与えられていないというふうに言えると思います。
でいきなりポンって出されて、もう電気のつけ方もわからない状態から入ってるので、本当そこら辺はしんどかったですね。もう
On to dete koje sam ja dobila vidi kao teret meni, a da li je za to dete bolje, neko od njih ne razmišlja.
Da se nekako uvijek vidjelo to, da kad je Julija kući i kad je sa nama okružena svima, da je to jedno dete, a da kad je u instituciji da je to drugo dete.
Desde se quedó ahí de Yumba, Arizona, y se quedó no sé dónde. Y me dejaron en otro cárcel y mi hijo se quedaron en otro lado, en el otro cárcel también.
Mi hijo ya tiene 3 meses que está en ese lugar. Es un bebé, es un pequeño niño. Cumplió 8 años allá adentro, encerrado como un delincuente.
Lolita si ricorda ogni piccolo momento che passa. Se Lolita rimane ancora qua, non dimenticherà niente. Non possono più i bambini soffrono, Diego soffre.
الغرفة اللي أخذوا أحمد عليها شرق الحاجز هذا هي. هو أحمد ورقم، حاطين لي رقم عليه. أحمد بدل ما كان روح صار رقم.
Ada syaratian adanya na babi akam lokara mi. Ada sortu fija. Ada sering kau kan asuti ada sering nya ayuma dia syaratian adanya na ba.
كانوا يسوون يشدون عيون ودي ويعذبوني ببور بلاستيك، يقولوا لي اعترف انك رحت ويا داعش يوم. أنا قلت لهم ما رحت، خلوني غصبا عني أعترف.
just so everyone is aware that a lot of the participants are currently being moved to attendees. So we have the panelists up front. I would kindly like to ask Manfred to give his presentation, share his screen, and then we will move on to the high-level panel.
Thank you very much, Manu, and hello to everybody who is joining now, not only from the high-level panel, but also from the public at large. I will give a short background to the global study. As you probably know, it's not the first one. There were two earlier global studies relating to children in armed conflict by Casa Magel, and on violence against children by Paulo Sergio Pinheiro. And the third one is directly following up, because Paulo said clearly that violence is strongest in institutions. And that's why the General Assembly decided in 2014 to request the Secretary General to commission another one on children deprived of liberty. And I was selected in 2016 and presented first the report to the General Assembly and then the full study in Geneva to the United Nations in November. Now, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is very, very clear. It says deprivation of liberty of children only as a measure of last resort. That means as an exceptional measure, and then only for the shortest appropriate period of time. Now, in reality, the Human Rights Watch video is still speaking about 1.5 million. These are the ones that are formally deprived of liberty. But in reality, we are talking about more than 7 million children that are deprived of liberty in all different institutions and detention centers. But there is a lack of reliable statistical data. And that is the main reason to really assess how many children are deprived of liberty, because depriving them of liberty is really for children in a time that is formative for them, and therefore it has a particular impact on children. We were focusing on 6 different areas. The one is in institutions, what we have already now discussed in relation to the Southeast European region, in the administration of justice, police custody, pre-trial detention, and of course in prisons. Also mothers or other primary caregivers who take their children into prison when they are incarcerated. Children deprived of liberty on national security grounds, that means primarily terrorism-related events, in armed conflict, child soldiers, and in relation to migration detention. Those are the 6 areas. And we also looked at it from cross-cutting perspectives, a gender dimension, children with disabilities, both in
Okay, so we have unfortunately lost Manfred there. Just a moment. Apologies for that. We're just going to wait 1 minute so that he can rejoin. Okay, so apparently Manfred is having a problem with the internet. Therefore, I would suggest that we already move into the high-level panel. So I would like to ask Veronica Gomez, President of the Global Campus of Human Rights, to begin the high-level panel. And please, if you could kindly, this for the students, not direct the first question for Manfred, but please move to the next one. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Manu. So welcome, a little bit prematurely, to the Global Classroom high-level panel discussion on the UN Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty. As Manu indicated, my name is Veronica Gomez, and I have the honor of representing the 7 regional programs of the Global Campus of Human Rights as president of the governing bodies. The Global Campus of Human Rights promotes human rights and democracy through higher education, specialized training, research and outreach with regional and interdisciplinary perspectives. It is possible thanks to a worldwide network of 100 member universities, the work carried out in our hubs in Europe, Southeast Europe, Africa, Asia Pacific, the Caucasus, Latin America, and the Arab world, the coordination of our main headquarters in Venice, and the support of the European Union, the Right Livelihood Foundation, and other donors. The Global Campus is one of the the Global Classroom is one of the flagship activities of the Global Campus. It's designed to bring together postgraduate students, professors, and experts from the 7 regions of the Global Campus and promote research and discussion on topics of global interest. This year, 7 research teams from each one of the regional programs have contributed papers relevant to the implementation of the global study on children deprived of liberty. Also this year, the high-level panel of experts that accompanies this 3-day-long event is open to external participants via live stream. The commitment shown by the students directly involved in this edition of the Global Classroom is to be commended, and also because they have pioneered the online version of this event in challenging times. Our special acknowledgement to the Arab Master Team. The GC Arab program has its headquarters in Beirut. Our heartfelt support to our colleagues. Today, the 7 regional teams of the Global Classroom will have the opportunity to ask questions to our guest experts in the high-level panel. I would like to welcome and introduce all members of the panel. First, Manfred Novak. I don't know if he's managed to join us, but we'll introduce him anyway. He is the Secretary General of the Global Campus of Human Rights. He is Professor of International Law and Human Rights at Vienna University, as well as Director of the Vienna Master of Arts in Human Rights. In 2016, he was appointed independent expert leading the UN Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty. Najat Madala Mjid is a medical doctor in pediatrics who serves as the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children. She leads and coordinates the UN High-Level Interagency Task Force on the UN Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty. Felipe González Morales is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. He is also a professor of public international law at the Diego Portales University in Chile, where he is also director of the Master in International Human Rights Law. Karabu Ozar is the director at the Center for Children and lecturer in the Department of Private Law of the University of Pretoria. Karabo appears regularly in the High Court and had her first appearance in the Constitutional Court in 2016. Benoit van Kiersblik is the director of the Belgian section of Defense for Children International and one of the founders and members of the Interdisciplinary Center for the Rights of the Child. He is chief editor of the Journal of Children's Law in Belgium, member of the advisory board of the UN Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty, and he co-convenes the NGO panel that coordinates 170 NGOs working on children deprived of liberty. Thanks to all of you. We are very honored that you are joining us today. If Manfred has not joined us back yet, no, it's not the case?
I did, it finally worked again.
Fantastic. So, we'll switch around and return to the global study at the end of the panel. So we start with the question for Manfred. So we will invite Grisa Rasiti, representing Global Campus Southeast Europe, the Southeast Europe team, to ask a question. Please, go ahead.
Everyone. So I would like to ask Professor Novak the following. As a former UN Special Rapporteur on torture, you have been in many different places where people are deprived of their liberty. Can you give a brief overview of your experiences in regard to disability-based detention of children? Our research shows that children with disabilities, in fact, are frequently subject to neglect, severe forms of restraint and seclusion, and as well as physical, mental, and/or sexual violence, which can amount to torture, inhuman or degrading treatment and or punishment, as was recently acknowledged by the European Court of Human Rights in the case of LR versus North Macedonia. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. First of all, my apologies for that we had internet connection so that I couldn't finish actually the presentation of the study. Thanks for your question and welcome to all the other panelists on this high-level panel. Of course, in more or less all my 18 fact-finding missions, I had also a special focus on children. And so many children with disabilities, both in mainstream institutions, in prisons, but also in very specific ones. From the Central and Eastern European region, I could give you an example from Moldova. I visited a psychiatric hospital in Balti with about 700 patients and appalling conditions, and 74 children were in the children's section, And all of them have been given a very high doses of tranquilizers. So in principle, they were staying in their bed and couldn't really do anything. And we asked the director whether she has a complaint mechanism, and she just said, no, it's not necessary to have a complaint mechanism because these patients never complain. So there was also many physical constraints. Another example would be Kazakhstan. And we visited many different institutions. For instance, a psychiatric hospital in Aktos with about 850 persons from 16 years on, and many of them were fixed to their beds. They had punishment in punishment cells simply because of having a disability. For me, there was also a prison for minors between 14 and 18. They said for those that are suffering from exceptional psychological circumstances, that's usually people who try to commit suicide, etc. They were locked up in quarantine up to many days, separated from others for half a year, etc. And then as a punishment, didn't get any kind of sport facilities. And for me, the worst place was this special institution for children, where we had 56 children between 3 and 18 years, 17 girls, 39 boys. Everybody was really regular beaten up as corporal punishment, a very strict regime. Their heads were shaved. They were treated like criminals, although they were orphans, street children, etc. But of course, you find the same in Georgia, in Jamaica, in Togo. I remember in a normal prison, all of a sudden, in a room, and I asked what is here. Yes, he's a child with a disability, and we simply don't know how we could deal with this person. And that is also the main, actually, facts in this case against North Macedonia, that a child was actually given away at birth, and then it was not a person, it was an institution, the Child Welfare Service, which was the guardian. And they put the child in different places. The child had very little physical disability and also a minor mental disability, but speech problems. And then they put this child in an institution that is really dealing with children who are physically disabled. And they say from the very beginning, we cannot communicate with this child, but still this child was kept there. Of course, he wanted to run away, and they tied him to the bed. So it's very often a structural issue that states are simply not equipped to deal with the different types of disabilities of children. And that's not, of course, only in Central and Eastern Europe, it's everywhere in the world. That's the main reason why there are so many children in institutions, because they don't have proper facilities to support the families so that the families can actually take care of their children.
Thank you very much, Manfred. Next, I would like to invite Shiraz Arbi, representing Global Campus Arab World, the Arab World team, to ask a question. Please state to whom it is addressed.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased and honored to address Madame Najat Moalla Majid. So I'm Shiraz Arbi, I'm a student with ARMA, and with a great team researchers, we've been focusing on children deprived of liberty due to armed conflict and national security in the MENA region, focusing on Libya, Iraq, and Syria, and Palestine. So my question is for you, Madame, is the following. So, of course, we'd like to take advantage of your expertise and know-how and ask you, based on your role as a UN Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children, and your expertise in mental health and psychological consequences, we'd like to ask you for a brief overview about the mental health and psychological consequences of children who are participants in the armed conflict, specifically in Syria and Iraq. In specific, we want to ask you about children of foreign fighters, children in previously ISIS-controlled areas, and more importantly, children with disabilities. In addition, we'd like to see if you have any common good practices in Iraq and Syria to deal with the children, especially the one with disabilities. We are asking this question because we did not, it was out of our scope of research, but it's important things that we'd like to know more and add to our research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you hear me. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I am happy to be with you. I will try to answer to your question, even it's a very difficult question, because I have not all the responses, mainly regarding, the promising practices. But I want, if you allow me, just before, to single out that children in Syria and Iraq are not different from other children in similar situation. And currently we are seeing, and you highlighted it in the beginning of your introduction, that regarding MENA, but we need also to be careful and to never forget that it's a global problem. We saw more and more children affected and or enrolled by violent extremist groups in Africa, mainly in Sahel and in Asia. Another point that made me a little bit having a concern, we have to be very careful in the wording. Or your question was about children participating in the violent extremist group. It means that they have an active role. And we have to be very careful because children really are not given an informed and voluntary consent. Regardless of the means or motive for recruitment, psychological evidence demonstrates the inability of children to adequately consent to involvement in violent activities and their lack of capacity to fully understand the consequences of this involvement. I just want to clarify that. And we have many scientific evidence that really highlights this consent and why we cannot speak about participants. And what is important really is that to understand, and I want to really to make it, to stress it, that children are easier to indoctrinate and less likely to resist, mainly when they are in vulnerable situation, living already in conflicted area, displaced, marginalized, living on street, disabled. Another point that we need to take into account that the recruitment is done by force, under threat or coercion. Children also, and mainly more adolescent children, could join terrorist groups based on a range of motivation, including the search for group-based identity, the ideological appeal of the group and sophisticated propaganda, the real or perceived exclusion, grievance, or cultural threat, the potential for economic gain or long-term economic stability, the prospects of fame, glory, or respect, and also personal connection, including family and friendship networks, mainly through social networks. Once young people are recruited, they become even more susceptible to terrorist control and indoctrination, including through the use of drugs and the threat of harm to their families. And we have it in Syria and in Iraq, but we have it also with Boko Haram, that is very well known for drugging children before sending them on suicide mission. These children within this indoctrination are victims by this group of sexual exploitation, trafficking, early and forced marriage, slavery. We need to take into account the children born to parents who were members of terrorist groups or mothers who were associated with or coerced by terrorist groups that have been placed in detention or in camps where they are experienced since early age harm, violence, deprivation. Many children are detained along with their primary caregivers because of their caregivers' suspected association with designated terrorist group. In many of these cases, detention conditions do not meet minimum standards. They lack access to adequate food, sanitation, basic services, healthcare, education, and no access to child protection mechanisms and services, as just highlighted by Manfred. Critically, many children face the risk of statelessness and many lack official documentation or birth certificates. In Iraq, for example, up to 13,000 children younger than 12 years old reportedly lack birth certificates or other documentation to establish their nationality. Approximately 90,000 Syrian, Iraqis, and third country nationals with suspected links to Daesh and their family members are currently being confined in camps such as Al-Hol, Al-Roh in northeast Syria, which include nearly 58,000 children from more than 60 countries, more than 3,000 unaccompanied and separated children. And you know that these camps are heavily securitized, with security consideration taking precedence over humanitarian standards and making it very difficult for humanitarian actors to provide support, mainly during this COVID. And you know that these conditions are really extremely difficult. More than 500 children are estimated to have died in Al-Hol and Al-Roh camps in 2019. Boys above 15 years of age have routinely been removed from their families and allegedly placed in detention centers, and more recently, security authorities seem to have also started detaining boys as young as 12 years old. Another point that it's important to take into account is the forthcoming upsurge of returning foreign fighters and their family members pose particular challenge for member states, law enforcement, judicial sector, and society. Some of the countries are willing to repatriate children from conflict zone, but not their parents or guardians, leading to family separation. My 3 last recent visits in Indonesia and in Maldives, mainly in these 2 countries, showed that currently these 2 countries are preparing the return of hundreds and hundreds of children, and within the placement in institution, and it means also separation of their family. What I want to highlight before focusing on mental health.
Sorry, Najat, your microphone all of a sudden.
What I want to really highlight is that the enrollment of children by terrorist group is a violence with a long and lasting impact. These children are victims of extreme violence during their association with the group, and at the same time, they may become particularly dangerous instruments of the group that recruited them. Children describe the process of their indoctrination and methods of control, including regular and physical abuse, torture, and the normalization of violence. In the words of one child, he told, after some time, the violence became part of me. And I want to highlight, in addition to violence caused by terrorist groups, children are also facing violence caused by states because of deprivation of liberty, torture, deprivation of family care, social exclusion, and stigmatization. It is important to keep in mind that these children have the same rights as all other children, and children being the most vulnerable are primarily victims regardless of their affiliation and must be treated first and foremost as children. When I describe all this situation, you can fully understand that the impact on mental health is very high. And already in 2017, Save the Children warned that the prolonged exposure to war, stress, and uncertainty means that children in Syria were in a state of toxic stress. Immediate and usually detrimental effects on children, including increases in bedwetting, self-harm, suicide attempts, and aggressive or withdrawn behavior. The post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and suicidal ideation, dating violence, substance abuse, and use of violence as a control tactic are main of the symptoms that these children are presenting. If left untreated, the long-term consequences are likely to be even greater, affecting children's mental health and physical health for the rest of their lives. Regarding, your question regarding some promising practices, regarding taking care of mental health of children, many countries in Europe, but also in the Syria camps and in Iraq, established some program regarding how we can deal with the post-traumatic stress disorder, developed many tools regarding the cognitive behavior therapy, working with the community really to mitigate the results of the mental health impact on these children. But unfortunately, it's not enough. In many places, it's really delivered by NGOs and it's not scaled up. And currently, with the big pandemic crisis, it's less and less provided. The really mental health of these children and mental well-being is a huge matter really to deal with and to take into account. We have some promising practices also regarding the release of children, and the COVID-19 pandemic has created an opening to re-engage in child justice reforms and maybe bring, I hope so, a sustainable long-term change. According to data from UNICEF, recently at least 31 countries have released, children, of which some were affected by violent extremist groups from detention in connection with concern about the spread of COVID-19. We had many practices regarding the prevention of radicalization and recidives, many programs done by many countries, but again, it's not scaled up, it's not harmonized, it's not standardized. Regarding the return and rehabilitation that is currently increasing, and you have many countries really working with, we have a big problem because many countries are dealing within the return of foreign fighters and their families as more about security problems than really a child rights issue. But we have also a good example, and we have one of them, Kazakhstan, who has repatriated a total of 595 individuals over 6 months. 406 were children, of whom 31 were orphans. And this is very important to highlight. The Kazakh official first visited camps and prison to identify the Kazakhstani women and children, and then verify their identity with family and friends and establish whether they would be accepted upon return. Following the repatriation, there was a strong media briefing from the president to highlight that this operation is humanitarian in nature and aimed principally to return children caught up in the civil conflict for reasons beyond their control. The rehabilitation process brought together a number of specialist agencies, including medical doctors, and children received surgical, vaccination, and nutrition and support, psychologists, educators, social workers, law enforcement officers, lawyers, and religious scholars. And the children previously associated or affiliated with violent extremist groups have often, been exposed to heavy ideological and religious indoctrination. And this is why it's important that a critical part of the rehabilitation process will thus be for children to create a new life framework within which to situate themselves. Another point regarding, and I want to highlight that also the role of children themselves and youth, the peer-to-peer support. Many child and youth-led initiatives were taken by children who were previously enrolled or affected, or maybe not, in de-radicalization, in rehabilitation. And these are really very, very important things. To conclude on this part, really, you see many pieces, but very frankly, and we just have a recent assessment done by the Global Compact on Counterterrorism, the UNCT, my mandate is part of it. We need to date, really to strengthen a better coordinated approach to act at several fronts at the same time in preventing not only radicalization, but de-radicalization, to have really strong and proactive rehabilitation and also sustainable rehabilitation based on community-based approach, alternative to deprivation of liberty and monitoring of what we are doing, and mainly involving children as part of the solution. Many thanks. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nadia. Next.
Can I have a follow-up question or just a small question?
Okay, it will have to be very, very small question because we're on tight schedule.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm just curious because in ISIS-controlled areas, boys and girls were used differently. Boys as soldiers, girls sexually assaulted and used differently. So, are there any interest and assessment on the psychological effect, how it was different on boys and on girls in the post-trauma period? Thank you.
To date, to be very frank with you, you have a global assessment, and my last report that I presented to the Human Rights Council was about mental health. And I have a dedicated, and I can share it with you, a dedicated chapter regarding children who were affected, you know, by violent terrorist groups. The main important issue, you have 2 points. You have children who were affected, mainly regarding the Yazidi community, where many girls were raped and were sexually abused and also become pregnant, and the impact is mentally very high, not only because they were raped and all this issue of rape that we know on mental health that destroy the life of children, that make really children having many mental psychiatrical behavior problems. This is very important, but the main point also was that these girls were stigmatized and rejected by their own family. And you add to that, you know, they feel guilty, and in the second, and they are stigmatized. Regarding boys, what appears, but we have no data. We highlight more sexual exploitation and sexual slavery and trafficking and early and forced marriage of girls, but many boys who were enrolled also by the Daesh and were also sexually abused by this terrorist group. And it was also a kind of having a kind of, you know, coercion on these children. And you know better than me that all this sexual abuse and violence on mental health of children, it has a high cost for these children, and it's very difficult to recover from it. And if you add all the, you know, environments of violence where they are living, and the stigmatization, and also the exclusion and deprivation of liberty, it's amazing the huge costs these children are going to pay that to date we are not taking into account in our responses.
Thank you very much. So now we move to Vasia Vozicki, representing Global Campus Europe's team. She will ask a question. Please state to whom is directed.
Hello, everyone. I'm Vasia from Greece. I'm an IMA student, and I would like to pose a question related to the implementation of the Child Rights Strategic Litigation Project. So in this regard, I would like to ask Ms. Karabo-Ozah, what are the core aspects of the strategic litigation project in relation to the follow-up of the United Nations Global Study on Children Deprived of their Liberty, and specifically, how could strategic litigation change the lives of children deprived of their liberty? And maybe on a second level, I think it would be equally interesting to know if there is any plan particularly addressed to children deprived of their liberty for migration-related reasons, and if so, what are the necessary steps that maybe other relevant actors and civil society could do in order to contribute to this, to the implementation of this project? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to be part of this discussion. I think before I delve into the question that's been posed to me, I just was reflecting about how the first question on children with disabilities, from the work that we do in South Africa, we realize how sometimes we must not forget the intersection. So we have seen cases where children with disabilities, particularly mental health disabilities, start as not being given the correct response in the system. They are deprived of liberty, and then they get placed in facilities where they're supposed to get assistance, and they don't get the correct assistance, and how those children then progress from there to being charged with offenses and end up in the criminal justice system. That's something that we need to keep in mind. We've had to intervene in a few cases where we've seen that the failure to actually do something and help these children by the relevant state responders leads to these children ending up then going into deeper into the system and being treated as offenders. And you may find that at the end they don't get long-term sentences, or they end up not being convicted, but they then get exposed to the criminal justice system. Just something to flag about how these issues sometimes intersect and can be seen how they get worse for children. On the question that's been posed to me, I think the starting point is that the importance of strategic litigation is to ensure that the international standards that we've all agreed to are obviously being adhered to. We have domestic laws in our countries to also ensure that those international treaties translate to something. So what we are trying to do with the litigation as a follow-up to the global study is to identify areas where the study has shown that there's lack of proper systems, and also the areas where we could do something to minimize the number of children who are being deprived of liberty. So we're focusing on those areas. To give you an example, in South Africa, we have children who are in institutions that are secure care because they have committed offenses. There are a few issues that come up when you deal with those centers. Firstly, we don't have an independent monitoring system. We don't have an independent oversight. Government can monitor itself, and that on its own is a problem. So we actually are planning in South Africa to, part of our global study follow-up is to do work in relation to what could be the right approach to that independent monitoring. Where could we place that? Could we place it in a human rights commission, or do we need an independent body to actually have that oversight? That will also look at what happens with the children in those institutions. Another big problem, children are in institutions, we give them 2 years, 3 years there, we think that when they come up, they'll be better, they should be rehabilitated. We don't know what programs are really being administered to them and how those are really helping children. And that is going to include, assessing that is going to include engaging with children about the experiences in those facilities. I think somebody earlier mentioned whether children had reporting and complaints mechanisms. We're also going to look into that, whether children have space to complain when they're not happy about what's happening to them in the facilities. One other thing we've seen with children in our institutions, particularly those who are there because they are deprived of liberty because they committed offenses, that our system, for instance, in South Africa, doesn't make provision for early release, whereas you have adult convicts being able to apply for parole. We have a problem that our law doesn't clearly allow for children to actually have an early release, and that's clearly an area where we're going to litigate. I think it was mentioned that COVID-19 allowed for some prisoners or children who are deprived of liberty, to be released early. In South Africa, we also started that. We actually questioned our ministry saying, well, there are children in these facilities, why are you not letting them go back home? How are they keeping contact with their parents and all that? So there's now momentum to build on in relation to early release of children, which is linked with the work that we want to do in relation to children deprived of liberty. We're also doing work in relation to children with mental health. We just 2 weeks ago got a court order where we forced a facility to actually put a program for a specific child who has mental health issues who they've just been warehousing, for lack of a better word, in a facility. So that is something that's very important. I know the other regions are doing other work, and I think Benoit might touch on it, but they're doing more work on the issue of migration as well, which we are also in South Africa going to focus on. You know that there's a hardened approach to child migration throughout the world. In South Africa, we've managed to achieve that you don't put children in prison for being in violation of migration laws. You treat them as children in need of care. That means they go into the facilities that I just mentioned, where children are put in institutions. There are problems there as well, obviously, in relation to monitoring, in relation to what is done for those children. Access to socioeconomic rights is a problem because they don't have documentation, right? They are not known to the systems. They can't get into schools. They can't get proper medical care. Then when they go towards the age of 18, there's a big issue about now what happens to them because they don't have identity documents. So here we're planning to actually, and have started a process towards a case where we're going to argue that children who've been in the South African, we call it the care system, who've been in institutions, and who it's clear that cannot be reunified with whoever in their country of origin, must be given rights of permanent residence at the very least. So then they can get an ID document. They don't become citizens, but that gives them a pathway to later apply for citizenship in the country, because we have a lot of those children that we've worked with over the years where we see that we just let them age out of the system, and then they now adult migrants who will be arrested and be deported. Meanwhile, they've been here for 10, 12 years. So that for us in relation to migrant children is very important. Also, we, I think not only for South Africa, all of us, when it comes to migrant children, we have to watch the policy and the legislative frameworks that are being changed to actually take a tougher stance. We in South Africa currently we're facing a lot of policy and legislative changes that are becoming anti-migration, and that clearly affects obviously children and how we assist them. So we would be we've already started making submissions to Parliament, and we'll be having an advocacy strategy in relation to how we ensure that we minimize some of the negative consequences that might flow from this hardened approach to child migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karabo. Next, the question from Saita Wood, Yutaka Warkol, representing the Global Campus Asia Pacific team.
Hello, everyone. My name is Setwood Yuttawaragun. I'm a student from the APMA program from Thailand. So my question is to Mr. Binur van Klesblik. So the case studies that the Asia Pacific team highlights in our paper is on children in immigration detention centers in the Asia Pacific. So our paper suggests that governments in the region mostly argue that it is their obligation to protect the national security, for instance, by adopting a very strict immigration law and prioritize this over any international obligations. So at a time when many states seem to suggest that international human rights law threatens their sovereignty, how can we try to ensure that these states stay accountable to their obligations? Thank you.
So thank you very much, and thank you also for the invitation from the Global Campus. It's a real pleasure to be with you and to have this exchange. Thank you for this question. It's probably one of the difficult questions when it comes to immigration detention of children. Because of course we have on the one hand human rights obligation, but on the other hand, we have all states have the right to decide who has the right to enter or not in the country. And we cannot challenge this fact. This is a fact that is recognized by international law. Any country has the right to decide who has the right to enter or not. But we shouldn't forget, on the one hand, that international obligation allows anyone to leave its country. So nobody can be prevented to leave its country. So if you have the right to leave your country, that means that you should be allowed also to enter into another country. That's on the one hand. And as you mentioned in your question, of course, there are many international obligations that most of the states, if not all, have ratified. But first of all, we should maybe remind that there are many reasons why children leave their country and try to enter in another country. And very often it's not illegally. They just claim for family reunification. They have grounds to claim to enter, to be allowed to enter in the country. But in many cases, the states are making the situation so difficult that using those legal avenues to enter in the country are not at reach for children. We have to recall also that if a state has the right to decide who can enter or not in the country, they also have ratified many human rights treaties, and they have many obligations under international legislation, and this is absolutely not in line with these obligations that have to prevail on national legislation. So there will be, of course, a discussion on whether the national legislation allows or not a state to prevent children entering, but entering in a country and having a right to stay, a legal status in the country is one thing. There is another thing with using deprivation of liberty and detention. And when it comes to deprivation of liberty, and especially when it comes to children, we know that most of the time, immigration detention in itself constitute a form of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Manfred has also highlighted this in the global study. We have so many examples where we see that the condition of the detention, the overcrowding of center, lack of access to basic rights and basic needs make the detention of children really in a big contradiction with all the principles that states have ratified. So some states try to argue and to say it is possible to combine deprivation of liberty with respect of human rights. And maybe especially in Europe, some states are trying to demonstrate that they have a high level of detention condition that makes detention in line with human rights. The global study has made it very clear that it is not possible to combine human rights of children and detention, and that detention is never in the best interest of the child and never a measure of last resort and used for the shortest period of time. So one tried to demonstrate that it's possible to combine two approaches that are impossible to respect in the meantime. So this has been very clearly stated by the global study, but also by many international and human rights bodies, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the Committee on Migrant Workers, and many special rapporteurs have also highlighted very, very clearly. So arguing that it's possible to combine both is not acceptable. Some states are also saying that it's possible that the detention is in the interest of the child because it allows to keep the family unity when they detain children with the parents. But this is replacing one violation of the rights of the child by another violation of the right of the child. Of course, a child has the right to remain with the family, and the family unity is extremely important. But this cannot justify the detention of children. Some states are also claiming that they detain children for their own protection, but without being able to demonstrate that there is a need to use detention for the protection. There are other means to protect children, and this is not necessary. There are other possibilities. So, having said that, I think that in your question, of course, the most important is what can we do towards that, and what is the role of the NGOs and the civil society. I think that there are, of course, many different levels depending on the role of the NGO in general, but it's extremely important to provide support to children and families. Providing information in an accessible way, in a language that is understood by the child, is certainly key in the very beginning, because a child, when he comes in a country, he doesn't know the procedure, he doesn't know sometimes the language, where to reach at, and so on. There is a need to provide social legal assistance to those children, and making sure that each child has a lawyer, a social worker, that there is an individual assessment of the situation of the child, an evaluation of its best interest, and that the child has the possibility to use the legal remedies, individually claiming to be released. So at the level of each individual child, there is, of course, a lot of support to provide, ensuring sometimes that the condition of detention does not harm too much, and sometimes it means providing psychological or medical assistance too. Then I think that it's very important also to try to challenge the legislation and the policies that end up in detention of children. And for this, of course, most of the NGOs are working also to in the field of advocacy and trying to make a case and develop arguments to demonstrate that there is the other possibilities for states than using detention, and that detention is not in line with the international obligation of the states. And as Karabo was also explaining, I think that using strategic litigation is certainly very important. Using all the international remedies at individual level also, many states have now ratified the third optional protocol that allows a child to submit an individual complaint to the Committee on the Right of the Child. If there is a regional court, like it's the case in Europe, but in Africa or in America, there are individual remedies that can be used in that regard. But at national level, there are very often individual complaints that can be used, or challenging legislation in, I don't know, for instance, the Constitutional Court. I will just end this in giving you the example and the experience in Belgium. In Belgium, we did manage by advocating and many different approaches in advocacy more than 10 years ago to get rid of all detention of children. And one of the activities that we did is to organize a mock trial of the states because of their use of detention of children. So we had this court with international experts and with a jury made of children. And it's children, Belgian children themselves, who did judge the Belgian states because in regard of this practice of detention of children. And with individual complaints and with many other activities, we managed to have a ban on detention of children during many, many years. The previous government restarted using detention, and it's one of those governments who is claiming that it's possible to combine children's rights and detention. And so we went once again in court to an administrative court, and we had to use some, I would say, some specific arguments. In principle, the principle of detention, it was complicated to challenge it in the administrative court, but this center was just near an airport, very noisy airport, a lot of pollution, and many, the fact of being there had many consequences on the health and development of the child. And so an administrative court said, okay, we will not discuss the principle of detention, but these conditions of detention are not acceptable at all. So now I think that we won for a few years. We will probably have to go back to court in a few years' time, but because this center cannot be used for detention of children. So if Belgium wants still to detain children in the future, we'll try to prevent that, but if in case, they will have to build a new detention center, which costs a lot of money. And I think that we can also use this argument. It costs a lot of money to harm children, while there are other possibilities, and we are also trying to highlight all the other possibilities. So these are a few possibilities that we can use to try to challenge detention of migration, child migration. Thank you.
Thank you, Benoit. Next, Valentina Agredo will ask a question on behalf of the Global Campus Latin America's team. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm Valentina Agredo. I'm a student from LADMA program. And my question is going to Felipe Gonzalez. According to our research on the situation of migrant children in North and Central America, push factors vary greatly, with many fleeing to seek asylum from war or civil strife, persecution, or situation of mass violence in their own country, insecurity, poverty, and family reunification. Specifically, the level of poverty in those countries is significantly above average Latin America. Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, the incidence of poverty is 74%, 68%, and 42% of the population. What, in your opinion, are the pull factors that drive migrant children towards Mexico and the US? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, and thanks for this invitation to participate at this important initiative of the Global Campus. I want to congratulate the Global Campus and Manfred Novak for this initiative and for taking so many actions to ensure that the global study on children deprived of liberty is really being disseminated around the world and gets an impact. I think that is crucial. And for me, as a special rapporteur on the human rights of migrants, this comes as at a timely moment, because next month I'm going to present a report on ending migratory detention of children and providing adequate care and protection to them to the General Assembly in October. Regarding the question, I think that the push and pull factors are interconnected, and it's difficult to provide a definitive answer to the question presented. I think that responses in this regard are therefore somehow speculative. As the question points out, there are push factors in the case of the Northern Triangle countries, including mass violence. These are countries with the highest rates of homicides around the world in places where there are no civil wars or wars in general taking place, high levels of insecurity and extreme poverty. And I would add also the issue of natural disasters. Many of them have occurred in recent years in Central America, including in these countries, with a very poor or limited response from the governments. As for the pull factors in this regard, I think that the situation, it is evident that the situation for migrants and asylum seekers in the US has worsened over the last few years. But even so, the conditions for them, when compared to the conditions in the countries of the Northern Triangle of Central America, are better in economic terms and in terms of security. So I think that's one important factor for people continue trying to move to the United States. There is also the issue of family reunifications, because there have been many persons from Central America moving to the US in the last few decades. And also the issue that there are a number of expectations that can be or cannot be correct, what the persons consider that they may find in the United States. However, having said this, I would say that I wouldn't say that the US as somehow is presented as a sort of per se magnet for human mobility. I think this is not different from our countries in the global north, and it's not different from our countries in Latin America, really, because in the case of the mobility from the Northern Triangle of Central America, I think there is also an issue of proximity to Mexico, of course, and to the US. But for instance, people from South American countries, they tend to move to Europe, especially to Spain, rather than to the US. And there is also a huge intra-regional human mobility in Latin America, especially of Venezuelans, which amount to about 4 or 5 million of persons who have moved in the last 5 years. So I wouldn't say that the US is a special case in this regard, but it's one of several destinations from people in human mobility in Latin America. I would like to make also a note about the migratory detention of children, which has been used as a deterrent, for instance, by the United States, an illegitimate deterrent according to international law. I have seen the evolution of this situation for the last decade or 12 years or so. At the time I was at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights as a rapporteur on migrants, migratory detention of children was still in place. Then it was virtually ended in the year 2009 at the beginning of the Obama administration. And for 4 years, there was no migratory detention of children in the United States, except for very few children. There was, and then there was this was not taken as a call for children to move to the United States. The level of mobility by children from Central America to the United States increased in 2013, after 4 years that there had not been migratory detention of children in the United States. So the factors were different ones. But this is a kind of recurrent practice, the detention of children in the US, that has remained since 2013 and became much stronger, worse in the last few years. Mexico also practices migratory detention of children in the region. A series of governments in Mexico have made statements that they will end this practice, but so far the practice of migratory detention of children in Mexico remains. Having said that, I would add that migratory detention in general and migratory detention of children in particular is not an extended practice in Latin America. It's virtually non-existent besides Mexico. And in fact, during the pandemic, there was this development in in Panama, where after 10 years or more than 10 years, migratory detention was reestablished, including migratory detention of children. And there was a very quick reaction from the international community in this regard, with actions from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, provisional measures issued by the Inter-American Court, and my mandate and our international mechanisms have also reacted. And this is not only because of the worrisome situation in Panama in this regard exclusively, but because of the impact that this may have for a regressive trend in this regard. We don't want Latin America to reestablish migratory detention, let alone migratory detention of children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felipe. Next, Salome Abuladadze will ask a question on behalf of Global Campus Caucasus, on behalf of her team. Go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Hello, Salome?
Yeah. No.
Go ahead.
Hello, everybody.
Yes.
I'm a student from Caucasus region, namely from Georgia, and my question directed to Mrs. Karabo. So it's a country. I'm a student from Georgia, and Georgia is a country which launched the diversion program. And my question relates to the drawbacks of the diversion program. For example, I mean, some minors may be induced to commit a crime, since they know they won't be sent to prisons, or may they be manipulated from them by adult criminals, or maybe they are the children of affluent families who have influence on prosecutors, and even the corruption risks may diminish the goals of diversion. So I'm interested in Mrs. Karabo's point of view. What is the solution to balance the advantages and disadvantages of diversion program? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I had to move because my connection was bad in the other room. Thank you for the question. I think the starting point is that we should never think that diversion is a soft option. The importance of diversion is to try and minimize what we're talking about today, which is having less children in institutions, particularly children who commit offenses. So it's very important for us to see is that most of our child justice systems are couched from, we can rehabilitate young people, we can reintegrate them, and then we minimize them committing offenses and becoming adult criminals. So that's the first thing I want to say. Insofar as people influencing children to, well, let me put it this way first. Your first part of your question, I think the children would have a fear of police. I'm yet to see a child who's not scared of being arrested. So if children end up committing offenses, I don't think in most of our countries is the majority of children. It will be situations forcing them or influence and all that, which you just mentioned. So I think that the children are in most of our countries deterred by the idea of having to interact with the police. And for you to be diverted, you actually have to acknowledge that you've done something wrong, and you have to then sign that agreement for diversion, either in front of a presiding officer, magistrate, or the police or a prosecutor. And I think in most of our countries it's like that. And then you go on a program where you're supposed to do something to now rectify your behavior. So that is quite a process on its own. In some countries like my own, we recently had to litigate because they introduced what they called institutional diversion, where if they give a child a diversion and they fail to comply with that diversion for whatever reason. For instance, we had one child who could not get to the place where they're supposed to do the program because their parents did not have transport. When the child came back to court to report, they were told that they must now go on a residential diversion. Now we're getting into that next level of now deprivation of liberty for something that a child should actually not be deprived of liberty. So you can see that diversion is not an easy option. It still is within the criminal justice system. It requires a child to acknowledge that they've done something wrong and there are consequences for it. And if they don't comply with that first part of it in most of our countries, then you step up to the next level where you get a harsher kind of approach because you fail to comply with your diversion. I think we must not conflate what we want to do for children as people that we believe that we can rehabilitate, we can better their future, versus what adults are doing with children. We can't control that influence, but we must remember that we even have international treaties such as the one on labor that states that children being used by adults to commit offenses is a worst form of child labor. And in South Africa, to give you an example, we've actually used that where we had children who committed a murder with adults, and they were being used, as you were explaining, sort of because there was this thing that if the child pulls the trigger, the child will get the harsh, well, will not get a harsher sentence, and the adults who didn't pull the trigger will also not get really the harsher sentence because they didn't pull the trigger. But the adults did get life sentence, and we intervened in that case, and in our intervention ensured that the child did not get life imprisonment, because at that time we still have life imprisonment for children. So we need to use the other mechanisms where if your country believes that there is quite an increase of adults using children to commit offenses, then we must put the correct provisions in our statute to combat that. But we must not then punish children because there's the potential of adults using them to commit offenses. And as I said, diversion is within the criminal justice system already, and we shouldn't take it lightly. We're going to the Constitutional Court now to confirm the fact that this approach of residential diversion for children who test positive or are found in possession of cannabis is not the right approach. And we won that in the High Court, and now our Constitutional Court has to confirm that. So my last point again will be to emphasize that we shouldn't think that diversion is a soft option, but it's an option that can give a space for us to rehabilitate children and ensure that they don't commit offenses in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Karabo. Next, the last question that will be asked by Opal Sibanda, representing Global Campus Africa. And I understand that it's an open question to all panelists. So let's listen to the question. Let's listen to the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Once again, I'm Opal representing GC Africa. So my question is, the global study on children deprived of liberty is a great success in terms of looking into the lived realities of children deprived of liberty for various reasons and coming up with recommendations. So given that many countries face numerous challenges, such as having a low number of child rights experts, social workers, and child-friendly structures, what challenges do the different sectors, that is the United Nations, non-governmental organizations, and academia face, and what role would the United Nations play in the implementation of these recommendations? Thank you.
Okay, shall we go by the same order that we used before? Manfred, do you want to start?
Yes, I mean, I'm very happy that the Interagency Task Force of the United Nations has identified Najat as being the main person, the chair of the task force, to actually use also her important mandate on violence against children in order to add this dimension of children that suffer violence because they are deprived of liberty, suffer structural violence. So I have full trust that with all the
the kind of strength that Najat has, that she will be a very, very dynamic person, and her office to actually follow up what needs to be done. But I think it's a joint effort. As the global study was a joint effort of so many different actors, I think it's the same in the follow-up. Without the NGOs, 170 NGOs, we would probably not have had a global study, because they were the ones that already convinced the General Assembly that it should commission a global study. We have, of course, we need governments. That's the most important. Governments need to develop plans of action. They are the ones that have implemented. Others can support them. You are right that there is not enough expertise. It's an awareness raising effort. UN agencies like UNICEF and others can assist states in creating awareness. But last but not least, I think the academic community plays a very important role, including, of course, all the different experts, special rapporteurs, treaty bodies, not only the Committee on the Rights of the Child, but also persons with disabilities and many others, the Human Rights Committee, but also academia. And in that sense, I'm very, very happy that the Global Campus of Human Rights kind of takes the lead, because we have this close cooperation with the Right Livelihood Foundation, and therefore a little money to carry out so many different projects. But again, they need to be done in close cooperation with all the other stakeholders, above all, of course, the United Nations. After all, it's a UN global study, and the UN needs to push states to implement it.
Thank you. Next, Najat.
Yes, thanks. I will be short because Manfred set the scene. I think what is important regarding, the follow-up of the implementation of the recommendation of the global study is quite challenging, because yes, it's involved many, many key actors, not only at global level, but mainly at national, local level and regional level. And here is a challenge, to be very frank. Yes, we reactivate the UN Interagency Working Group, the UN Interagency Task Force on follow-up of the global study with concrete and specific recommendation, with a timeline in close cooperation with civil society and also with academia, but also mainly our main target are state members, because they are in charge of really implementing it, but not only at global level, because what is important is also how we are going to mobilize the country level, because the government at country level is important. And here, regarding my mandate, I can speak about my mandate. What is important is to make sure that deprivation of liberty and all the recommendation to avoid deprivation of liberty and detention related to migration in institution for national security, all that is really taking into account duly in all the national action plans. Not asking for an additional one, but to make sure that we have the information we need and the action we need. In the same time, is also what is important is to make sure also how we can build bridges and connect, those who have expertise, countries who have already promising practices, but also challenges, and to have kind of sharing lessons. This is very important. And here it's, as I was telling to Manfred and the coalition of NGOs, within the task force, we already finished the roadmap of all the recommendation, and currently working with all the UN system, not only at global level, but also at regional and country level, to make sure that we are defining concrete action to follow up, to avoid also duplication and cross-cutting, aspects, but also to make sure that we are working in a complementary way. And not only the UN system based in New York, but also in Geneva, including also the special procedures. This is very important. The academia, the NGOs, but I want really to insist also during, also my country visits, I have a dedicated, issued points and time related to children deprived of liberty. This is very important to make sure that there is a kind of follow-up. But I need to add one key main actors that it's really very important are children themselves, because this is very important not to see them always as victims, but also as part of solution. And currently we are working, mapping all, the child and young people initiative to make sure that we are going to highlight that and also to involve them within the response provided by the state. And my last point is also using the facts that currently we are in the phase building back better after the pandemic, and while accelerating the pathway to achieve the SDG agenda. And we are currently in the decade for action. And also this year we are, commemorating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and it's about multilateralism. To use also this opportunity to give visibility to children, not only on blah, 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 but to make sure that children are part, within all the responses regarding the SDGs, but also regarding building back better. And just to remind you currently that we are highlighting and we are following my mandate and with many UN system what is going on currently, because you are seeing, and I am sure that all of you are seeing the number of arrests, torture of children due to social protests. And you have it in Belarus, you have it in Somalia, and this is very important to be very careful about what is going on, because deprivation of liberty due to the pandemic and because of this closing measures, we are seeing also a pushback regarding human rights more widely and children's rights. These are the main points I want to add to what Manfred was highlighting. Many thanks.
Felipe?
Well, on the issue of migratory detention of children in particular, I would like to stress the need for engagement, strong engagement in the follow-up and implementation of the Global Compact on Migration. As you know, the Global Compact on Migration provides that states will work to end migratory detention of children. So I think there is an important opportunity here. In fact, during the discussion of the Global Compact, in some of the drafts, there was a peremptory statement about concluding the migratory detention of children. That wasn't in the end in the final text, but I think we are close to that, and we have to work on that. For this purpose, there's going to be the review forum at the General Assembly on migration that will follow up from the point of view of the General Assembly, the Global Compact. There is also the newly established UN Network on Migration, and there is the role for the special procedures and treaty bodies, and of course for the civil society and many actors in this regard to ensure that we take all opportunities based on the Global Compact on Migration to end the migratory detention of children. Thank you.
Karabo?
Sorry. Thank you. Just quickly, I think some of us like to fight. So I think my starting point will be that we all must challenge our own governments on the ground. I think these things are not new issues. The study highlighted issues that exist in our country that are systemic. And as much as we have reduced monies from donors, we have challenges as organizations on the ground. I think we must continue to put pressure on governments to adhere to the international standards, and where they fail, we must actually litigate where that becomes necessary. But one thing that's also mentioned is the AU in the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. Our countries report there, and we do alternative or complementary reports. And when we do those reports, we can link the study with what's happening in our country, and that can then be debated when our country report and go before the committee, and those concluding observations from the committee can then link some of these issues, so that there's monitoring of 5 years from now. Have you progressed from the time where the UN Global Study said that you have so many children in your institutions? And that's something that we need to do as a, focusing on NGOs on the ground in our countries. We need to do that. These reports must not sit there and gather dust, as well as the UN committee reports and concluding observations. So we must make that link. I do think maybe one other thing that needs to happen is the UN could maybe see how they could also link up with the AU, particularly the Secretariat and the people who are working in the office on the African Charter on the Rights and Wealth of the Child. and could be a collaboration to see how there could be some support there for African countries in particular, in relation to ensuring that they at least start doing better in relation to the issues of children deprived of liberty and access to child justice as a general issue, which I know that at the AU is already something that's very high on the agenda. So that will be my 2 cents. Thank you.
Benoit.
Thank you. My colleagues have probably said the most important, so I don't have that much to add. First of all, I would like to underline the fact that you think that the global study is a great success. So as such, this is already very important. And I see Manfred smiling, and I think that he knows, and we all know what we have been through, and ending up with this study is as such an achievement. And we have, of course, to use and to ensure that this study doesn't stay in a shelf without proper follow-up. There is a need for a follow-up at international level. It has been said, and it has been taken over by Najat's office, and this is extremely important because we need one place where all the effort will be coordinated, and someone that has a view on the activities action that everyone is undergoing, and this is extremely important. I think that we also need a clear mandate from the UN. The UN has committed the global study, has requested this to be done. Now they have to follow up and to take the conclusion and decide what should be the best follow-up. The follow-up has to be organized at national level too. During the global study, there was supposed to be a national focal point for the follow-up of the study, and now there should be a national focal point for the implementation of the study. So continuing to remind the states to implement their legal obligation, that's also very important. All the UN agencies and mandates have something to say and to do around detention and deprivation of liberty of children, and there are many of them on health, migration, sale of children. I mean, name it, you have them. We have to continue assessing the situation and counting. One of the important achievements of the global study is also to have clear number. We know that these are not definite number, but we have an estimate there, which is very important to work with, and we have to count them on a regular basis to see if there are improvements or not, and in which field we are doing better, and in which field we have to improve the situation. Many actors have to continue keeping the study on the agenda, very high on the agenda at national level and at other level. Many states also need technical assistance because, of course, there is an issue with the political will. So political will, you tackle it with advocacy, you challenge it in many different ways. When there is technical difficulties or a state doesn't know how to deal with the situation, they may need technical assistance. And I think that it's very important to ensure that there is technical assistance available for states to help them to improve the situation. We have to continue making research on how to improve, what are the lessons learned, how to implement programs that will end up with a reduction of the deprivation of liberty. Then coming to the financial side, on the one hand, as Karabo said, many donors and international finance bodies are now reducing their support to states, to NGOs, and so on. So, but we have, on the contrary, to push them to increase their support and to include the follow-up of the global study in what they support, in the project and action that they support. But also we have to show to the states that reducing detention, the use of detention of children, will on the long term end up with less public expenses. And so these are a few of the paths that we should continue to follow to ensure that we don't forget this important study.
I think Najat has a comment that she wants to add. A short comment. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to react because I was very short regarding the regional level. You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, the regional level highlighted. Just to let my colleague that I had developed a joint roadmap with the African Committee of Child Rights Experts and Welfare. And I joined all the session, and this is one point that is taken into account, and also with the African Commission on Social Affairs, because this is very important. And I remind also that this year is the 30th anniversary of the African Charter on Child Rights and Welfare, and also is a midterm review of the Agenda 2040 of Africa Fit for Children. And I want to add just one point regarding what Benoit was telling and Felipe. Sure, the global compacts are very important, the global compacts on migration and on refugees, that we are part of it, but also the global compact on counterterrorism, because we are part also of it, and deprivation of liberty and alternative and rehabilitation are really are a big block in this global compact regarding counterterrorism. And the other, as was highlighted by Felipe, is related to all migration related issues. Thank you, Veronica.
Okay, before returning to Manfred and the presentation of the global study that we all are very anxious to hear, just a few words to remark on the fact that we've heard about detention, and we've also heard about vulnerability, about the impact of statelessness on children, the impact on lack of identification, the normalization of violence for children, this lack of true consent in the situations that they face, and our conclusion that detention is never in the best interest of the child, as indicated by the global study. I think there've also been lots of expressions on which are the possible solutions for these big challenges. The need for a coordinated approach, the importance of rehabilitation, the importance of community-based approaches, the importance of making information available to children in the correct manner, in the right manner, the assistance that is required, including the points on strategic litigation that have been made, the importance of action plans on the part of the states, and most important of all, having children as part of the solution, children participation. Thank you very, very much to all of the experts for informing the research of the participating teams in this year's Global Classroom. And most of all, thank you for your contribution to forming a new generation of experts on the rights of the child. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with all of us and providing inspiration to the future experts in the area of the rights of children. So now I'll pass it to Manfred so that hopefully we can go on with the presentation of the global study.
Just one moment.
Would you enable the screen sharing for us?
Manu, can you do it?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me all? Yeah, I hope it will work this time. And I will do it very quick. As I said, it's a third in a line of global studies on children, armed conflict, violence against children. It's directly following up because deprivation of liberty is a form of structural violence. I presented the report in October to the General Assembly in New York, and then last November to the United Nations in Geneva. The main principle in the convention is that deprivation of liberty can only be a measure of last resort. So every individual case must be looked at. Are there non-custodial solutions? Then deprivation of liberty is not in accordance with the convention. And if it's absolutely necessary for the shortest appropriate period of time, we know that the situation in reality is totally different, but we didn't have reliable statistical data. We still don't have the best data, but I think it's the best scientific study so far when we come up with a total of 7.2 million children deprived of liberty. 6 areas, institutions of all kinds, from orphanages to institutions for children with disabilities, etc. The administration of justice, police, pre-trial detention, and incarceration. Children living with their mothers, usually, or other primary caregivers in prison. Children deprived of liberty in the context of armed conflict, in particular child soldiers recruited by non-state armed groups, and on national security grounds for terrorism-related charges, and children deprived of liberty for migration-related detention. And then we looked also at the whole study from different cross-cutting dimensions, the gender dimensions, on one hand boys and girls, but children from the LGBTIQ community, children with disabilities in mainstream institutions as well, and in special institutions for those children. A huge study on the impact of deprivation of liberty on the physical and mental health of children, and most importantly, 274 interviews in 22 countries with children who are experts in themselves to tell us what they experienced while deprived of liberty. Altogether, about 7.2 million children, and this is still a conservative estimate. The clear majority, 5.4 million in institutions, and only a minority of them have been sent by a decision of the court. Usually it is the parents or other caregivers that feel that they are not able to deal with a child with disability or other children in need of special care, and that's why are ending up in institutions. The administration of justice, about 1 million per year in police custody, and 410,000 in pre-trial detention. And in prisons, 330,000, again, a very conservative estimate in immigration detention, 35,000 in armed conflict, and 1,500 on national security grounds in countries where there's no armed conflict on their territory, and about 19,000 living with their mothers in prison. And what are the main recommendations? Of course, to bring or to reduce this huge gap between the law and practice. So significantly reducing the number of children is the most important recommendation. That means primarily deinstitutionalization. There are always non-custodial solutions, family-type settings in foster care, but primarily to give those children back to their families and support the families. Effective child justice systems with special children's courts, specially trained police officers, prosecutors, applying diversion at every stage from the police arrest to the final sentencing. So moving the children from the criminal justice system to the child welfare system, and shorten the length of detention. Refrain as much as possible from detaining primary caregivers. So if judges have to look into account, what does it mean if I sentence a woman to a prison sentence? What does it mean for children if she is the primary caregiver? With respect to immigration detention, this is always in violation of Article 37 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because there are always non-custodial solutions available. So that means prohibit, states must prohibit and abolish every form of immigration detention of children. In relation to armed conflict and terrorism-related crimes, treat children, even if they have committed crimes, primarily as victims, not as perpetrators, in order to advance their recovery, their rehabilitation, and socialization in the society. Address the root causes, and we have seen that in all the different studies that our students have done. What are the main reasons actually? And then invest resources in order to support the families and apply detention as a measure of last resort and for the shortest appropriate period of time. Now the follow-up, I have said already, is primarily in the hands of Najat, and there are other actors involved, the NGOs, advisory board, as experts, and academia, including the Global Campus of Human Rights. So if we are able to achieve only a little bit, then it is a first step in relation to millions of children, and we should save them from detention, because depriving them of their personal liberty is depriving them of their childhood, and it should be related to the implementation of the Agenda 2030, and in particular to leave no child behind, and that also means no child behind bars. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy for all the participation in this high-level panel, but in general in this global classroom. Thank you very much.
I can just add on to that. Thank you so much. And also for your flexibility for everyone to be able to stay a bit longer. And this will be very useful because we will be able to cut this whole video together. Thank you so much to the high-level panelists. Thank you so much to the students, to the program directors, and of course the research coordinators. I wish you a really pleasant day still, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Bye.
Thanks, Manu. Thanks, Najat, Veronica, and everybody else.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
All the best.
Good.